I've seen a lot of people jump on the cheapest gaming laptops they can find, only to end up with a machine that throttles after a few minutes of a raid or a creative workflow. The regret that follows a $1,200 deal is real. You're left with a laptop that can't keep up with modern titles or render-heavy projects, and you're stuck paying for an upgrade sooner than you'd like. That's why I wanted to see if the ASUS ROG Strix G16 actually feels like a smarter buy, or if it's just another expensive promise. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. First off, the thing that makes the Strix G16 stand out in a crowded market is the combination of a high-end graphics chip and a desktop-class processor in a 16-inch chassis. Most mid-range laptops still pair a 60 frame per second GPU with a low-power CPU, which means you'll hit a bottleneck the moment you load a demanding game or start a 4K video export. The Strix swaps that out for an RTX 5070 with 12GB of GDDR5 memory and a Ryzen 9 8940HX that can sprint past 5GHz when the workload spikes. In everyday use, that translates to a laptop that doesn't ask you to close background tabs or lower settings just to stay playable. I tested it with a recent open-world shooter, a competitive esports title, and Adobe Premiere Pro, and each time the frame count stayed solid without the fan winding down to a low, rattling hum. What really matters for a gaming laptop is how that power translates to the screen you're looking at. The Strix's 16-inch WUXGA panel runs at 165 Hz with a 3 milliseconds response time, which is a noticeable step up from the 60 Hz panels you'll find on budget machines. In fast-paced shooters, the extra refresh makes enemies feel more readable, and the reduced motion blur helps when you're trying to track a fast-moving projectile. I also appreciated the color accuracy when I switched over to photo editing. The display is calibrated close enough to sRGB that you don't have to guess whether a hue is true or washed out. The only downside here is that the panel isn't a full 1080p, so you'll lose a little crispness compared to a true 19201080 panel, but the higher refresh rate tends to mask that for most gamers. Cooling is often the Achilles heel of laptops that push this much silicon, and ASUS has gone with an intelligent cooling system that spreads heat across 2 heat pipes, a vapor chamber, and a trio of fans. In practice, that means the laptop can stay near its boost clock for longer stretches without hitting the thermal ceiling that forces a CPU to drop back to 3 GHz. I ran a 30-minute stress test in a closed room with the fans at their default curve, and the temperatures hovered in the low 80s Celsius, not ice cold, but far from the 95+ you'll see on cheaper designs. The trade-off is a slightly louder fan profile when you're in the middle of an intense raid, but the sound is more of a focused than a rattling scream, and it never drowned out in-game audio. Storage and memory are often overlooked, but the Strix gives you 32GB of DDR5 RAM and a 2TB NVMe SSD. For gamers who keep a library of AAA titles, the SSD eliminates load time worries. Most games I launched popped up in under 5 seconds, even after the drive was nearly full. The 32GB RAM is more than enough for gaming, but it also means you can run a virtual machine or a secondary editing suite without swapping. The only practical weakness is the lack of a secondary M.2 slot, which means you're locked into that 2TB capacity unless you're comfortable swapping the drive later. Who should actually consider this machine? If you're a serious gamer who also dabbles in content creation, think streaming, video editing, or 3D modeling, the Strix gives you the horsepower to juggle both without buying 2 separate devices. It also fits a mobile professional who needs a high refresh display for UI work and a GPU that can handle occasional rendering. On the other hand, if you're primarily a casual gamer who sticks to indie titles or older games, the $2,600 price tag is probably overkill. Likewise, anyone who travels constantly and needs the lightest possible notebook might look at a thinner Ultrabook. The Strix, while portable, still weighs over 5 pounds and has a chassis that leans toward a desktop feel. Value for money is where the discussion gets nuanced. The headline specs look impressive, but the real ROI comes from the combination of the high refresh panel, the robust cooling, and the massive SSD plus RAM bundle. When you compare it to a laptop that offers a similar GPU but only a 60 Hz screen and a 256GB drive, the extra cost of the Strix starts to make sense because you won't need to upgrade the storage or compromise on visual fluidity. However, if you can find a machine with a slightly older GPU, say an RTX 3060 but with a 144 Hz display and a 1TB SSD for a few $100s less, you'll need to weigh whether the extra frames,